Hey guys, Fox here, and today we're going to be doing the third installment of finding out who the biggest USFL draft bust of all time was with the 1985 USFL draft. So this draft happened before the 85 season, and everyone at this point knew that the league was going to be moving to the fall in the 86 season, but for this 85 season, it was still going to be played in the spring, and naturally this draft had to happen. Now, this draft was weird. It only had like 17 first-round picks, despite there not even being 17 teams. It was really weird, and overall, I'm pretty sure it had like the least amount of players from the actual draft up until this point play in the NFL in the first round, which we'll see. But without further ado, let's just talk about the rules for this one. In terms of the 85 USFL draft bust rules, this is once again based on only what the player did in the USFL and NFL, but it is based on both. As I feel like if you go to like another league, I'm not really going to count it that much. And then number 2, the player must have been a first-round pick. I'm not doing the top 12 because there wasn't a ton of picks. I mean, it was only 17. So if you were a first-round selection, you are eligible to be the biggest bust. And the third is that if the player did play in the USFL, it does matter a bit more, as naturally that means that the player actually did suit up for that team. So they had to have actually, been decent. So yes, unlike the last two, you didn't have to play in the USFL to be eligible for this one since there was only 1 year in the USFL. That's basically how I'm viewing it. So without further ado, let's get started. With the number 1 overall pick in the 1985 USFL draft, the Birmingham Stallions selected wide receiver Jerry Rice. Rice did not go to the USFL. Instead, he decided to become the greatest football player of all time, and yes, the greatest. What Rice did in the NFL is just obscene. The guy was a 10-time first-team All-Pro, as well as a 1-time second team. Yet he did that second team literally in 2002, which he was drafted in 85. That's insane. He was just an unbelievable player throughout his entire career. He's on multiple all-decade teams. He was a scoring leader, literally a scoring leader as a wide receiver. If you're not a kicker and you're a scoring leader, you had some sort of insane season. The dude's in both college and Pro Football Hall of Fames. The dude has so many records. He's got postseason receiving records. He's got touchdown records. He's got career receiving yard record. Hell, he even has the career yards from scrimmage record and never even played returner, which is how most of these guys get up there. The dude was just unbelievable. He is the single greatest football player of all time. And considering the fact that he was picked far later in the NFL, as he was like 16th or 17th overall pick, the Stallions really did know how good this guy was. So credit to the Stallions and their, GMing team. But yeah, Rice is definitely not a bust at all. With the 2nd overall pick in the 1985 USFL draft, the Arizona Outlaws selected cornerback Torrey Nixon. This is a pick that isn't really up for the biggest bust because this year had a lot of busts. But in terms of was this guy a success even in the NFL? No. Even in the NFL, he was a second-round pick, as at this point, a lot of NFL teams either knew that these guys weren't going to go to the USFL or that the USFL wasn't going to be able to compete with them. So they picked a lot of these guys higher, as naturally the last 2 years. The ones who signed with the USFL ended up getting picked, in the 5th or 6th round, but not in this case. But yeah, he didn't go to the USFL, but he did go to the Niners. He did win a Super Bowl. But he wasn't, the starting for real cornerback, but he did play for 4 years on that team. He did get a couple receptions, including an 88-yard pick six. He's definitely not the biggest bust on this list. It's just that he himself wasn't really a great player. But for a 33rd overall pick, even in that sense, you could argue he was a bust. But he's not the biggest, but you'll see why, so yeah. With the 3rd overall pick in the 1985 USFL draft, the San Antonio Gunslingers selected cornerback Isaac Holt. Holt would end up being in the league for quite a while. He was a 30th overall pick, another second-round pick. And he ended up getting 2 total touchdowns. He blocked 7 punts during his career, which is pretty insane. He ended up getting 23 total interceptions. He played in over 100 games. He was never a Pro Bowler by any means, but he was a Super Bowl champion with the Cowboys. And he did play from 85 to 92. So he did actually play a pretty decent career, especially for a second-round pick. He's definitely not one of the biggest busts ever. He's not a home run, slam dunk pick, but he was definitely a solid pick, especially for the Cowboys, who ended up getting him from the Vikings. So he definitely was a very solid player. He's definitely not a big bust. With the 4th overall pick in the 1985 USFL draft, the Denver Gold selected linebacker John Nevins. Now, despite the fact that Nevins never played in the NFL, despite the fact that he only played 1 year in football at all, he is without a doubt unable to be on this list for the biggest bust. In fact, he is technically speaking, as my rules applied, one of the best players from this draft because he actually did play for the team that drafted him in the Denver Gold, and he played well enough that he was actually on the Sporting News All-USFL team, or the USFL All-Star team. As you guys know, there were like 2 different All-Star All-USFL teams, and he was on one of them. He was on the Sporting News All-Star team. So he was a very, very, very solid linebacker. I mean, he was an inside linebacker that was on the same list as Sam Mills. So this guy was really solid. He had a couple interceptions, a sack, and the natural tackles weren't a statistic, but he was great. Naturally, he doesn't have, literally the only photo of him is pretty much that one. But the bottom line is, overall, though, he was an All-USFL All-Star type player, so he's not eligible for a biggest bust, and he's actually, in terms of, technically speaking, he was the best player picked in this draft if you're viewing it from just a USFL standpoint. Definitely a great player for that team, for that 1 year, naturally. Great pick. With the 5th overall pick, the New Jersey Generals selected another linebacker, this time in Jesse Penn. Penn was at the second linebacker taken. He would end up only playing 3 years. He'd play all 3 years for the Cowboys. He'd end up getting a couple sacks and interception. He didn't have the best career. He only played a couple years, but just like I said earlier, this isn't even closely enough to actually make him into the bust category for this year, which is insane. But yeah, he was another second-round pick that didn't really pan out a ton. He played 3 years. He did, get multiple fumble recoveries. So I'll let it slide. He's not up there for the biggest bust, but we'll see why later. But definitely not a great pick. With the 6th overall pick, the Houston Gamblers selected Raphael Cherry. Cherry was picked as the 6th pick as a safety, and let's just say that a lot happened with this dude. So he was a 5th-round pick in the NFL. He ended up playing for the Redskins for a year, and then he was gone a year. Then he came back for the Lions for a couple of years, and then and then everything just pretty much went by for him. The dude was like literally arrested. He was like just. Oh my god, it was terrible. The dude, killed his wife and just got sentenced to jail for, so many years, 30-year sentence. So, the bottom line is this dude was not a good guy whatsoever. And even in terms of just his NFL career, I mean, it's not like that was why he got out of the NFL, because this happened, years after. He literally only lasted 3 years. So not only is he a bad human being, the guy wasn't even really a good football player. He was decent. I mean, he did get 5 interceptions, and like I said, there's no way that's eligible for the biggest bust. But man, what a guy. Just not really the best type of guy, but you know what? Man, the weirdest thing to find out, I will say that. But he was a starting safety, defensive back in the NFL for a couple years. He's not up for the biggest bust. With the 7th overall pick in the 85 draft, we have finally reached what is the first player to be eligible for the biggest bust on this year. Defensive end Bob Standifer. My god. This guy literally did nothing in terms of a career. The dude, I'm pretty sure, is mainly an insurance salesman now. If you look him up, you'll actually find him, doing insurance type stuff. But man, in terms of his football career, not good. For a dude to be picked top 10 and then only end up playing 4 games and then never doing anything else. I mean, remember, all these stats back then, tackles weren't a real stat back then. Sacks were, interceptions were. This was an end. He didn't get a single sack in the 4 games he played in. He is, without a doubt, up there for the biggest bust. Now, there's a couple others that we'll get to very shortly that are also up there that I know it's insane that they're actually up there with this guy. But man, this guy was so he did nothing for them. He is, without a doubt, up there for the biggest bust. When you literally don't even do anything for the team that drafted you and you actually played for them in the USFL, that's bad. This guy, Bob Standifer, eligible for the biggest bust of this year. With the 8th overall pick in the 85 USFL draft, the Bandits selected cornerback Don Anderson. Another player picked in the 30s in that 85 draft that did not pan out, which is pretty shocking, I'm going to be real with you. Yeah, not a good year for second-round picks that time. Overall, he played 2 years in the NFL. He played 1 year for Indianapolis and then 1 year for the Buccaneers. He played in 16 total games. He did record a pick, a fumble, and a fumble recovery, which he did recover for 38 yards. Definitely not a great player, but by no means is this someone that is, eligible for the biggest bust, as we just talked about with Standifer and a couple guys we'll get to later. He's not the biggest bust, but he was definitely a huge flop in just overall. So for that reason, he's not up for the biggest bust, but he definitely was a bust even in the NFL as well. So yeah. With the 9th pick in the 1985 USFL draft, the Houston Gamblers used their second selection this draft to select Mark Tranowich. He would never play for the Gamblers. He would be a second-round pick in the NFL, but unlike most of those second-round picks, he actually did pan out pretty okay. Like, literally okay. He played 3 years for them. He'd be, playing in multiple games. But then he'd eventually go to the Eagles. Then he would come back to the Bills. Then he would go to the Cardinals. He basically played for, 5 years total. But he did play for 5 years. The dude was an offensive lineman. So he did his job, protecting guys as much as he could. But the fact is he did recover a couple fumbles, which is always good to see your boys on the line do that. But, the dude played center and then had to go to guard, but he did play for, a few years. He's not eligible for the biggest bust, but he was definitely, let's just say, not that good. Now, with the 10th overall pick, the Birmingham Stallions selected someone. You know how much credit I gave him for Jerry Rice? This is the opposite, because this is another guy who's eligible for the biggest bust this year. They selected offensive tackle Kevin Allen. Kevin Allen is someone who is actually insanely famous in the NFL by a lot of circles, but he's famous for the same reason why we remember Ryan Leaf and Johnny Manziel. This dude was bad. If you ever hear someone say, a player was, not that good. No, this dude was straight up trash in the NFL. To put it simply, his best years were when he was playing in, the Arena Football League or the World Football League, or the World League of Football, whatever it was called. The reason is this dude played 1 year for the Eagles as the 9th overall pick. He was horrid. His first career start, the Giants got 8 sacks. And then by midseason, he was only on special teams. Then you had one of the most insane quotes I've ever seen. Buddy Ryan, naturally on the Eagles, the coach, thought so little of him. He once described him as someone who could only be useful if you want someone to stand around and kill the grass. And then he looks like a USFL reject. And hey, considering the fact that the USFL team actually took him a spot later than the NFL, I don't know about that. But the bottom line is, he was bad. Deadspin, for how bad a lot of their articles are, from what I've seen, this one they probably got right. They actually voted him in 2011 as the 4th worst player of the history of the NFL. Said with the quote, the 9th overall pick out of Indiana had a special way of blocking opposing pass rushers. He would lean his body forward, then fall down. And never had the Eagles had a combination of a bad person, bad player that could match this guy. This dude also got banned for cocaine. He was banned for a few years as well. Granted, it's not like it probably mattered. He was probably never going to get picked up anyway. But yeah, he's up there as the biggest bust because of just how horrid his NFL career went. With the 11th overall pick, the New Jersey Generals selected Lee Rosen, running back. This is the first offensive skill position player taken since the first overall pick with Jerry Rice. And in terms of how he did, he'd actually only play in the NFL. As I said, almost none of these guys played in the USFL. But he was solid. He wasn't, this world-beating running back, and he was never even really a starter. But he played for the Giants for a good while. He played from 85 to 91, and then he ended up playing a year in Cleveland. He won 2 Super Bowls, both with the Giants, naturally. And he was mainly, a receiving back. The dude was pretty consistent. He had 415 yards rushing and then 453 receiving. The dude was a solid player. He wasn't, a great player, but he was your good, certified, backup-type running back. Think of a Dante Foreman today, he plays hard, he does whatever he's asked, but he doesn't, complain a lot. He's that kind of guy, gets the job done, won't be your starter, but is good enough to come in, get a couple nice plays in. Definitely a solid pick, especially considering the NFL, he was actually taken in the 8th round. So the fact that he was taken that late, yet he still ended up being this solid, pretty incredible. With the 12th overall pick, the Tampa Bay Bandits selected a really solid one in defensive end Mike Gann. He would never play for them, sadly, but he was definitely solid. In the 8 years he played, or the 9 years he played for the Falcons in the NFL as second-round pick, he was, again, one of the second-round picks that wasn't that bad. In 118 games, he did record 23.5 sacks. He had 11 fumble recoveries and 2 touchdowns. kind of a simple thing. I mean, the dude was a solid player. He wasn't, this excellent top-tier defensive lineman, but he was solid for what he was. Second-round pick, got over 20 sacks, played, for a multitude of years. Definitely a solid player. Definitely, one of those guys you look at and you say, yeah, he had a solid career. That's pretty much all I can say about him. With the 13th overall pick, the Arizona Outlaws selected linebacker Ronnie Washington. Washington, he would go to the NFL as an 8th-round pick as well. He would play 3 years in the NFL, which were insanely weird. He played 85, 87, and 89. I know, just insanely weird. He would never really be a real player after his first year, though in the 2 games he did play for the Raiders in 87, he would end up getting a sack. But yeah, him, being picked in the 8th round as well as Mike Gann. Pretty funny, not gonna lie, as Gann was a 2nd-round pick, but you know what I mean? Picked by the Falcons, but overall, he would end up getting a fumble and a fumble recovery. He'd get 1.5 career sacks. Like I said, the bar is set so high for how bad you have to be in this draft to be considered the biggest bust. He's definitely not the biggest bust. Was he a good player? Not even a good player in the NFL sense, but you know what? He avoids being the biggest bust from the 85 USFL draft. With the 14th overall pick, we get another skill position offensive player, as the Baltimore Stars with their first-round pick selected Chris Burkett. This is definitely a really solid pick. He was a 2nd-round pick, as mainly the 30s were terrible in that draft, but he was the 42nd overall pick. He was never, a Pro Bowl-type player, but the dude ended up getting over 4,000 receiving yards in his career, despite the fact that he didn't even play a ton. He played from 85 to 93. And he still managed to get that many yards. So he was a consistent, type of guy who would get, like 300 to 500 yards a year. He'd get a couple touchdowns. Definitely a solid player, not, the best number 1 wide receiver option. But one of those solid, secondary, tertiary options that can help, get yards when you need them. Definitely a very solid pick. Not the best, but solid. With the 15th overall pick, the Arizona Outlaws proved that their draft was still not really done being not that good, as they picked Sean Thomas, safety. The TCU safety, the dude, to put it simply on how well known this guy is, literally this is the only image that he's probably on. So, in terms of the NFL career that he did have, he played for, of course, Atlanta and Cincinnati. And in terms of what he did, he played 11 games. And that was basically it. He played 11 games. Yeah. He didn't, get any major stats that I saw, or nothing else. So, to put it simply, he did not have a good career. Really at all. But I will say that he still isn't up for biggest bust from this draft. I know it's insane. But he's in pretty much either of the other videos. I know this might be a spoiler. He's probably definitely the biggest bust if you look at the other 2 years, at 83 and 84. But dude, the fact that these guys, as we already mentioned, the 2 guys, Standifer and Allen, how bad they were, he's really, really close to being up there, but I don't think he's as bad as those guys. Now we're at the LA Express's final back-to-back first-round picks. The first one they used was the 16th overall pick. They selected running back Steve Sewell. He ended up getting picked in the first round by the Broncos as the 26th overall pick. And as for terms of what he did for the Broncos, he was a very, very, very solid player type of guy. It was kind of like Lee Rosen, except, more of a, consistent player kind of deal. The dude ended up getting a really weird stat line for running back. The dude had over twice as many receiving yards as he had rushing yards, as he took receiving back to a whole new level. But the dude was a very solid player. He ended up having a total of 26 total touchdowns, which ironically was 13 each. But he had over 2,000 receiving yards and almost 1,000 rushing yards, despite the fact that he wasn't even fully the starting running back. He was definitely a solid player. He didn't fumble the ball that often. In terms of his whole career, he only fumbled in his 8-year career or 7-year career. The dude only fumbled 5 times, which is definitely solid. He was a very solid pick by the Express and was the first of their picks that ended up being, it was the first pick and it was definitely better than their second one, which we'll get to in a second. As the second pick, they had the 17th overall pick in the 85 draft. They selected a dude that you probably never heard of. They selected James Maness. Maness was another player from TCU, but unlike Sean Thomas, this guy does have a picture in the team photo, because I can actually find the team photo. I'm pretty sure that's him, the guy in the middle. But Yeah, third round pick in the NFL. He played literally that 1 year. He played 8 games for the Bears. But hey, it was 85, so he got a Super Bowl ring. So they did get a Super Bowl ring, congrats to him. He returned 2 punts for 9 yards, and he got 1 reception. But his reception, to be fair, was 34-yard to catch, so that's pretty solid. But, yeah, that's it. That's literally his whole career, which is, pretty whack, I'm not gonna lie. So it's definitely hard for me to say if he's up there with, the other two as a biggest bust. Considering the fact that he only played 1 year and 8 games, it's hard, but I'm gonna go with no. I think the thing with him is just like it's hard. But I think with him and Sean Thomas, I think that they weren't bad enough as well as, not playing enough. They didn't have that combination like the other two did to warrant being up there. So he'll barely avoid being the biggest bust. So that leads to the question of who is the biggest draft bust from the 85 USFL draft. To put it simply, there is only 2 players to me that fully get the definition of being a terrible pick and a bust. It is Bob Standifer, the 7th overall pick from the Invaders, who went to Tennessee Chattanooga, or it's the offensive tackle Kevin Allen, who's the 10th overall pick by the Stallions. Put simply, the Invaders draft as a whole was terrible. Even when you go into what players went to the NFL, they had 3 first-round picks and really none of them did anything in the NFL, which is always, pretty funny. The Stallions went from having one of the best selections any team has ever had by picking Jerry Rice number 1, which showed that they did have some scouts better than the NFL scouts, versus their 10th pick being Kevin Allen, who is ranked potentially as one of the worst players in NFL history. To put it simply, this is really close. Because it's basically, do you go with what is a very simple, easy definition of you are a bust, of you played in 4 games, had almost no impact, and that was your whole career? Or do you go with the guy who played in more than 4 games, but was so terrible that your coach had one of the most coldest quotes I've ever heard someone say about a player? It's a really tough debate between Allen and Standifer. And to me, it's hard to bounce back and forth, but if I'm gonna be real, it's really hard. It's really hard to determine. It's like when you make an argument between, let me put it this way. A very good way to describe it is like the argument between Josh Rosen and Sam Darnold. Hear me out. You can make an argument that Josh Rosen was actually a better selection than Sam Darnold. Both picks ended up being huge busts, but Rosen showed you how bad he was immediately so you could move off him, versus Darnold, who gave you enough flashes to where you decided to stick with him longer than you should have. That kind of idea here. Except to a whole nother level, as it's literally a dude who played 4 games and they realized, man, you suck, versus a dude who ended up playing in 16 games, but only started, a few, and played in a few as offensive line, but then got banned for cocaine and stuff. And it's hard, but, man, this is a really tough decision. Because Kevin Allen, yeah, he did end up going back to play in the Arena Football League and the World Football League, or World League of Football. But the dude, it's like, he got banned for cocaine. Would he have ended up playing at all? I don't think so. But Standifer literally only played 4 games and did nothing. So it's tough. But I feel like because of the fact that he was picked a bit higher, the fact that he literally did nothing of note in the USFL and was actually in the USFL, I'm going to go with Bob Standifer as the biggest draft bust from the 1985 USFL draft. I think that he just barely beats out all these other guys. I think that Sean Thomas playing, 11 games in the NFL, even if he didn't, play a ton of safety, still better than him. I think that when you look at James Manis only playing a couple games, he played a couple games for the Super Bowl champion team. That's at least something. And then Kevin Allen, man, he can take the cake as arguably the worst pick by Eagles history, sure. But I think that when all in all considered, Standifer just literally did nothing in the 4 games he played in the USFL, and he was a 7th overall pick. I mean, I think that he definitely deserves to be it. Overall, that's it for the 85 USFL draft video. Naturally, the 86 video will be coming up at some point, so I'll get that out whenever that ends up happening. This has been ZomFox. If you enjoy this content, want me to notify since I upload any videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell, and as always, have a great night.